my name is Olivia Adams, and I'll be talking about forced labor in the United States. Its history, forced labor in the modern economy, efforts to end the practice, why those efforts haven't worked, and what the U.S. and its citizens can do to help end the practice. The history of forced labor in the United States begins in 1526 with the arrival of the first enslaved people from Africa in United States territory. Brought by Lucas Vasquez de Ayllon to Winyah Bay, North Carolina, a little under a century before the infamous ship the White Lion would bring 20 more. They would later be brought with him to the territory that would later become the state of Georgia, where de Ayllon founded a colony called San Miguel de Gualdape, named after the local indigenous tribe, the Guale. This colony didn't last very long. De Ayllon died within a month, the settlers suffered from dysentery and starvation, and though the colony's leadership was inherited by Captain Francisco Gomez, his leadership was soon challenged by Ginés Doncel, who wanted to return him to Spain. Doncel's faction arrested Gomez and aimed to arrest his supporters. However, in what's considered to be the first slave rebellion in North America, the enslaved Africans set fire to Doncel's home, freed Gomez and his supporters, then escaped, going on to live with the Guale. Our next significant event in the history of forced labor is in 1607 with the founding of the British colony of Jamestown, Virginia. British immigrants brought with them the practice of indentured servitude, through which poor immigrants would have their fare paid for by wealthier immigrants or by the captains of the ships that they were traveling on, but that would then be obligated to work to pay off their debt. While enslaved Africans were present in Britain's American colonies until the mid to late 18th century, indentured servitude was the most common form of labor. Between half to two-thirds of all European immigrants came to the British colonies through indentured servitude. While some indentured servants came willingly, others were sent involuntarily, as indentured servitude could be used as a punishment for crimes, and parents would sometimes sell their children into indentured servitude in the hope that their children would have a better life in the Americas once they paid off their debt. Regardless, most indentured servants weren't paid for their labor, though some received parcels of land at the end of their servitude, and their indenture could be sold to others who needed the unpaid labor. Bacon's Rebellion in 1676 marked a shift in labor practices in the American colonies. After the defeat of the Powhatan Indian Confederation in 1646, the Confederation's lands were divided between the English planters. This upset freed black slaves and formerly indentured whites who thought that they deserved a portion of the land. Nathaniel Bacon, a wealthy landowner, also thought that the land should go to the freemen, and led them in attacks against other indigenous tribes in an effort to steal their lands as well. Bacon was jailed for this, and when he was released, he declared himself the leader of all freemen, landless immigrants, and slaves, and it led an uprising against the Virginian government, which ended when Bacon died of dysentery and the rebels surrendered in exchange for pardons. This event is largely credited with both a shift from primarily using indentured servitude in the American colonies to the use of slave labor, and with the origins of social separations between black slaves and white indentured servants. From here, plantation owners and wealthy landowners, fearing more uprisings from white indentured servants, started to transition away from indentured servitude and began relying more heavily on the labor of enslaved Africans. This intensified after the creation of the cotton gin, which made the production of cotton more efficient. As more and more cotton plantations were created, more enslaved Africans were needed to meet the demand for labor, and over the course of the 18th century, the forced labor of enslaved Africans became the dominant form of forced labor in the colonies. After gaining their independence from Britain, the American colonies, now the United States of America, continued the practice of slavery in their territories. However, during this time period, the abolitionist movement, which aimed to end slavery in the United States, began to gain traction. One of the first significant pieces of abolitionist legislation was the Act Prohibiting Importation of Slaves, which was passed in 1807, which made the importation of enslaved people illegal. However, the smuggling of slaves into the United States would continue up until the Civil War, which began following President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. After the end of the Civil War, the 13th Amendment was ratified, officially ending slavery. However, an exception was made in the amendment which allowed for the use of forced labor as a punishment for crimes. During the Reconstruction period, southern slave states began passing legislation known as Black Codes, which took advantage of this exception in order to enslave freed black people again through the use of the penal system, the creation of unfair yearly labor contracts for black workers, of which refusals to sign could result in fines or imprisonment, and laws preventing black workers from holding any other occupation than farmers or servants. Thus, while slavery had ended on paper, many formerly enslaved black people living in the South soon found themselves enslaved again. Progress on the international stage was made in 1948 with the United Nations passage of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or the UDHR, which included freedom from slavery as a human right. While the UDHR wasn't an enforceable document, its passage signified the acknowledgement of all members of the United Nations, including the United States, that forced labor violates human rights. The International Labor Organization, or the ILO's Abolition of Forced Labor Convention, ratified in 1957, was the first enforceable piece of international legislation on forced labor, which declared that all signatories must work towards ending forced labor practices within their borders. In the United States, a major milestone came in 2015 with the passage of the Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act, which had established a ban on the importation of goods and commodities made with forced labor, though identifying such good was not always possible, and the law is not always enforced. Another important milestone came in 2018 when Colorado became the first state to close the 13th Amendment's prison labor exception, being followed by 6 other states over the next 5 years. This brings us to 2023. A number of misconceptions still exist surrounding forced labor. That forced labor is mostly an issue in undeveloped countries, that most victims are undocumented immigrants, that forced labor is illegal in the United States, and that most forced labor is work in the sex industry. In reality, a significant number of victims of forced labor live in supposedly developed countries, with some estimates putting the number of victims in the United States being as high as 50,000 per year. Of those victims who are immigrants, about 71% came into the United States with H-2A or H-2B visas. The number of incarcerated victims of forced labor who aren't included in many estimates of forced labor, given that forced labor as a term of imprisonment is still legal in 43 out of 50 states, is also very high. Of 1.2 million incarcerated Americans, about 791,000 perform work as part of their imprisonment, many of them involuntarily and without pay. Given that Black Americans are imprisoned at a much higher rate than other Americans, Black Americans are disproportionately impacted by forced labor. Child labor in the United States is a form of forced labor with its own challenges that make it difficult to address. Children in foster care are often forced to do domestic labor and are subjected to physical violence or threatened with the withholding of necessities if they don't comply. Children in foster care are also more likely to be the victims of sexual exploitation, with a 2022 survey commissioned by the Administration for Children and Families, which is part of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, finding that about 40% of the high-risk children that they surveyed had allegations of human trafficking and sexual exploitation while in the foster care system. Undocumented migrant children are also at high risk of exploitation, often working to help repay debts owed to the people who helped them enter the United States. And as many come without their parents to live with people or relatives they might not know, many don't have anyone to protect or advocate for them. Here's a chart showing the division of forced labor in the United States by sector, with the data having been provided by the National Human Trafficking Hotline. The largest sector is domestic labor, workers who provide cleaning services, cooking, child care, etc. Agriculture is the second largest sector, followed by construction, then illicit activities like drug and sex trafficking, with other industries making up the remaining 2/3 of forced labor cases. At any place in the supply chain, the goods we consume could be contaminated with forced labor, whether it's made in the US or somewhere else. But why should you care about forced labor? Because of its human impact. In one report published in the Journal of Public Health, a number of studies on the health outcomes of children who are the victims of forced labor were reviewed, and it was found that such children experience high rates of adverse health conditions, including malnutrition, infectious disease, and behavioral and mental disorders, among other conditions. Victims of forced labor experience higher levels of drug and alcohol abuse, which can impact their lives even after their forced labor ends. Victims of forced labor, because of their work is unregulated, face higher risks of injuries while in the workplace, and are less likely to receive compensation or time off for injuries. For example, many incarcerated people report receiving no formal training in their assigned jobs and are often not given personal protective gear while working in dangerous work positions. Of course, a number of efforts have been made to counter forced labor, both internationally and the United States. The International Labor Organization is an international organization associated with the United Nations that works to track and stop instances of forced labor worldwide. The ILO's recommendation number 203, put forward in 2014 to help achieve the ILO's goal of ending forced labor by 2030, recommended a number of steps that countries could take to help eliminate forced labor in the global supply chain. Examples of recommendations that they gave include creating public awareness campaigns, starting skills training programs for at-risk groups, and stopping fraudulent recruiters who take advantage of people seeking work and trap them in abusive contracts, or traffic them to other countries where they're dependent on their employers. In the United States, the U.S. Department of Justice and the U.S. Department of Customs and Border Protection work to identify and prosecute cases of forced labor, commission studies to better understand the crisis, and create reports and public awareness campaigns to help make Americans more aware of forced labor. In 2021 alone, federal officials seized $486 million of goods made with forced labor. Withhold release orders, or WROs, are one tool that Customs and Border Protection can use in preventing the importation of goods made with forced labor, being orders that allow the seizure of goods suspected of being made with it. The 2021 Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act is another example of legislation made to address the importation of goods made with forced labor, specifically goods created by Uyghur Muslims in China, being one of the most notable pieces of legislation on forced labor in the United States in recent years. However, despite efforts to end forced labor in the United States, forced labor continues to be pervasive. A significant portion of the supply chain is contaminated with forced labor, despite legislative efforts to ban goods made with the practice. But imported goods aren't the biggest problem. According to a multi-university study published in the journal Nature Food, up to 62% of commodities sold in U.S. markets suspected of being made with forced labor come from within the country, with some of the highest rates being in the agricultural sector. There are many reasons why efforts to end forced labor in the United States haven't been effective. Forced labor cases are expensive to prosecute and convict. Gathering evidence, identifying victims, and identifying all the perpetrators can take months or even years. And given how dependent the United States is on cheap goods, much of it produced with forced labor, passing laws restricting the importation of forced goods can be difficult. When voting on the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act in 2021, some legislators criticized the bill for being too strict, worrying that it would cause such a reduction in imports that it would hurt the economy. Identifying companies that source their products from factories and farms that use forced labor can be difficult, as it requires cooperation between the United States government, the companies, and the countries that those companies source their goods from. Especially in cases where the forced labor is state-imposed, it can be difficult to convince countries to comply with efforts to track or identify cases of forced labor. And across most of the United States, forced labor in prisons is still legal. Given that the labor of those incarcerated is often used to offset operating costs and turn a profit for the prison's owners, without a legal incentive to end forced labor, prisons have little incentive to end the practice on their own. So what can we do about it? Well, the United States government needs to increase international cooperation. Better research to identify instances of forced labor, incentivizing countries to comply with international labor regulations, and providing funding to experts and activists working to end forced labor internationally, who are often critically underfunded, is one way that we can fight forced labor on the international scale. Educating high-risk individuals and communities on forced labor is another way to prevent forced labor before it happens. Educating immigrants about forced labor and fraudulent work recruiters on arrival to the U.S. and providing them with resources in their preferred languages, providing resources for foster children, and public awareness campaigns could all be useful preventative measures. Consumers can also protest with their wallets. Those who can afford to do so should buy only from local businesses or businesses which have proven that their goods aren't manufactured or produced using forced labor, though buying ethically isn't always affordable to lower-income Americans. And of course, closing the 13th Amendment loophole is the simplest and most immediately achievable way to reduce the amount of forced labor in our economy. The hashtag #EndTheException campaign hopes to achieve the passage of a bill to end the exception allowing incarcerated to be forced to work. All of this needs to be done in addition to helping the survivors of forced labor recover from their experiences. Survivors often need financial assistance and mental health and addiction treatment, and community support systems have been proven to lead to better mental health outcomes for survivors of forced labor. But these efforts still likely won't be enough. On-demand production and a liberal market economy that prioritizes speed and cost efficiency is incompatible with the goal of eliminating forced labor. While we can make changes in our own lives and advocate for legislative changes to help fight it, We'll never fully eliminate forced labor so long as we prioritize profit and convenience over people. I hope you've come away having learned something new about forced labor in the United States and that you've been inspired to make changes in your own life to help end the practice.